You are a slave. Only a slave would be offended by that. If you still need the world to love you, this will feel like death. You are a slave, and the only reason that sentence burns is because something inside you recognizes it. If you were free, you wouldn't flinch. If you were sovereign, you wouldn't defend yourself. If you were awake, you wouldn't feel the need to argue. Only a slave gets offended when someone names the cage, because the cage has become home. And you don't hate your chains. You've polished them. You've personalized them. You've built an identity out of them. You call it your personality. You call it your politics. You call it your trauma. You call it your achievements. You call it your beliefs. But it is a collar, and you wear it willingly. You are not enslaved by a government. You are not enslaved by corporations. You are not enslaved by secret societies. You are enslaved by the need to be approved. You are enslaved by the need to be seen. You are enslaved by the need to be right. You are enslaved by the need to matter. And that is a far more brutal master, because it lives inside you. No one has to force you to obey. You police yourself. You edit yourself. You censor yourself. You posture for imaginary audiences. You build a self that can survive in the system. You build a self that can be liked. You build a self that can win, and you protect that self at all costs. That is slavery, not chains, not whips, not prisons. Identity. You wake up and immediately step into a role. You step into your job, your family identity, your ideological position, your moral framework, your online persona, your trauma story. You defend it, you curate it, you compare it, you upgrade it, you optimize it, and you never question whether it is real. You are not living, you are maintaining a character, and the system does not need to enslave you physically, because you are maintaining the prison psychologically. You think freedom is the ability to choose between options. But what if all the options are inside the same cage? Left or right, conservative or progressive, religious or atheist, entrepreneur or activist, minimalist or hustler, spiritual or scientific, all inside the same frame. The frame is comparison. The frame is insecurity. The frame is, I must become something in order to be enough. That is slavery. And when someone says you are a slave, you feel insulted, because the identity hears threat. The ego hears destabilization. The false self hears extinction. Only a slave gets offended. A free person hears it and asks, where? A free person hears it and asks, show me. A free person hears it and says, if that's true, I want to see it. But a slave reacts. Because the slave believes the master is necessary, you think the system is external, but the system is psychological. It is the structure of comparison and self-preservation. It is the constant scanning for status. It is the constant fear of being nothing. It is the constant need to win, even spiritually, even morally, even in rebellion. You can rebel and still be enslaved. You can reject society and still be enslaved. You can leave religion and still be enslaved. You can leave politics and still be enslaved. And if you still need to be somebody, if you still need to be validated, if you still need to be right, you are owned. And the master is fear. Fear of irrelevance, fear of humiliation, fear of being unseen, fear of being nobody. So you build a self. You reinforce it daily, and you defend it violently, and not with weapons, with arguments, with sarcasm, with posturing, with superiority, with virtue, with shame, with projection. The system does not need to control you, because you are terrified of being nothing, and so you volunteer. You volunteer to compete. You volunteer to perform. You volunteer to signal. You volunteer to conform. You volunteer to be outraged. You volunteer to defend your tribe. You volunteer to build your brand. You volunteer to have a take. You volunteer to exist as an opinion. You are not forced. You are conditioned, and conditioning feels like freedom. You call it personality. You call it authenticity. But it is reaction. It is inherited programming. It is trauma crystallized into identity. It is culture downloaded into your nervous system. It is family expectations wearing your face. And if someone says you are a slave, Your nervous system reacts before your mind can even process the claim, because your body knows the cage, and your body is protecting it. That is how deep it goes. You are not enslaved by external tyrants. You are enslaved by the need to survive psychologically, and survival in this world means constructing a self, a defensible self, a marketable self, a lovable self, a respectable self. But the self is the cage. This is why you feel uneasy, because the idea of losing your identity feels like death. And it is. The slave must die, not the body, not society. The slave self, the constructed self, the insecure self, the comparative self, the self that exists only in relation to others. That self cannot be freed. It can only collapse. And you do not want that. You want improvement. You want optimization. You want healing. You want growth. You want empowerment. You want transcendence without annihilation. You want resurrection without crucifixion. But that is not freedom. That is ego refinement. The slave can become a high-functioning slave. The slave can become a spiritual slave. The slave can become a moral slave. The slave can become a revolutionary slave. But the slave is still owned by the need to preserve itself. And that is why when someone says you are a slave, you feel attacked. Because the slave self is fighting for survival. Not because the statement is cruel, but because it threatens the illusion. If you were truly free, you would not defend your image. You would not defend your beliefs. You would not defend your identity. You would not need to, because you would not be invested in being something. The world runs on insecurity. Insecurity fuels economies. Insecurity fuels politics. Insecurity fuels religion. Insecurity fuels culture. If you are not insecure, you do not consume compulsively. If you are not insecure, you do not compete compulsively. If you are not insecure, you do not signal compulsively. The system does not need you dead. It needs you insecure. Insecurity keeps you obedient. Because an insecure person will always look for authority. An insecure person will always look for validation. An insecure person will always look for belonging. And the system provides substitutes, groups, ideologies, movements, brands, leaders, influencers, spiritual teachers, political saviors. And you attach, because you are afraid of standing alone. And if someone strips that from you, you feel exposed. Only a slave needs a master, even a benevolent one. And here is the brutal truth. You don't want freedom. You want a better master. You don't want to lose your identity. You want it validated. You don't want to die. You want to ascend. You want to become more, not disappear. But freedom feels like disappearance because the slave self dissolves. The need to be someone dissolves. The need to win dissolves. The need to be seen dissolves, and what remains is terrifying. Silence, no identity to defend, no image to maintain, no story to sell, no position to argue, just presence, and presence cannot be owned. That is why the system cannot tolerate it, not because it is politically dangerous, but because it is economically useless. A free person is not easily manipulated. A free person does not need constant stimulation. A free person does not need constant affirmation. A free person does not need constant enemies. So the system feeds you narratives, feeds you outrage, feeds you identity hooks, feeds you moral battles, and you engage because engagement makes you feel alive. But engagement is not life. It is stimulation. It is adrenaline. It is tribal bonding. It is psychological warfare disguised as meaning. You are not free because you choose your battles. You are free when you no longer need them. Only a slave needs constant enemies. Only a slave needs constant affirmation. Only a slave needs to be right. And the fact that you feel resistance right now, that is the proof. The resistance is not coming from truth. It is coming from the self that is terrified of collapse. And collapse is necessary. Because you cannot reform slavery into freedom. You cannot optimize the ego into liberation. You cannot rebrand the cage into a kingdom. The slave must die, not violently, not politically, internally. The identification with the self must collapse, and that feels like annihilation. Because everything you thought you were dissolves. Your opinions lose their urgency. Your image loses its importance. Your status loses its weight. Your narratives lose their grip. And what remains is terrifyingly simple. You are, not as a role, not as a brand, not as a moral hero, not as a victim, but just awareness. And awareness cannot be enslaved. But awareness is not impressive. It cannot be monetized. It cannot be weaponized. It cannot be tribalized. It cannot be used to climb. So you avoid it. You prefer identity. You prefer noise. You prefer belonging. Because belonging feels safe, even if it is a cage. Only a slave is offended by the suggestion of slavery, because freedom would not need to defend itself. Freedom would investigate. Freedom would examine. Freedom would look inward and ask, where am I owned? Where do I react? Where do I need validation? Where do I need to be seen? Where do I need to be right? That is the beginning. Not rebellion, observation, radical observation of every insecurity, every defensive reaction. Every moment you feel the need to assert, every moment you feel the need to correct, every moment you feel the need to prove. That is the slave reflex. And until you see it, you are owned by it. You can talk about freedom. You can quote mystics. You can study psychology. You can meditate. You can preach. You can build movements. But if you still need to be someone, you are not free. You are decorated. And the most dangerous slaves are the decorated ones. The intelligent ones, the moral ones, the awakened ones, because they believe they are beyond slavery. And that belief is the strongest chain. True freedom humiliates the ego. It exposes the insecurity beneath the performance. It strips the narrative. It removes the armor. It does not make you impressive. It makes you empty. And emptiness is terrifying, because emptiness cannot be validated. Emptiness cannot be praised. Emptiness cannot be attacked. And so the slave resists. The slave prefers the noise. The slave prefers the drama. The slave prefers the war, because war feels purposeful. But purpose can be a drug. Identity can be a drug. Being the one who sees through it all can be a drug. Even rebellion can be a drug. And the slave can become addicted to anti-slavery rhetoric while still enslaved to identity. Freedom is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the collapse of the need to be anything. And when that happens, you are no longer offended, because there is no self to protect, no image to defend, no narrative to maintain. And if someone says, you are a slave, you simply look. You do not react. You investigate. And if it is true, you allow it to burn, because you are no longer invested in survival of the ego. That is death, the death of the slave. And it is the only path to freedom. Not political freedom, not economic freedom, not social freedom. Inner sovereignty, where nothing external determines your worth, where nothing external determines your identity, where nothing external can manipulate your fear. Because fear is seen, insecurity is seen, the slave reflex is seen, and what is seen clearly loses its grip. You do not fight the system, you outgrow it. You do not destroy the cage, you realize it was internal. And when the internal cage collapses, the external systems lose their power over you. You can participate without being owned. You can work without being defined. You can speak without defending. You can exist without performing. And that is dangerous, not because it is violent, but because it cannot be controlled. You cannot bribe someone who needs nothing. You cannot shame someone who is not protecting an image. You cannot threaten someone who has already died to identity. That is why the slave self fights so hard, because it senses extinction, and only a slave would be offended. If this is landing, if this is unsettling, if this feels like it is dismantling something inside you, good, that is the beginning, because freedom does not feel empowering at first. It feels like loss. It feels like humiliation. It feels like nakedness. It feels like death, and that is the cost. The slave must die. The identity must collapse. The insecurity must be exposed, not destroyed, seen. And in being seen, it loses authority. You are not evil. You are not stupid. You are not weak. You are conditioned. And conditioning feels like identity. But identity is not essence. It is defense. And defense is slavery. So when you feel offended, pause, look, ask, what is being protected? What am I afraid of losing? What image is being threatened? What narrative is being destabilized? That is your master, and until you see it, you serve it. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And once you stop protecting it, it collapses, and when it collapses, you will feel like you are dying, because you are. The slave is dying, and what remains is not impressive. It is not marketable. It is not dramatic. It is free. And free does not need to shout. Free does not need to prove. Free does not need to defend. Free does not need to be offended. Free simply is. And if you still need the world to love you, this will feel like death. It's time for you to die.